Lecture 3: Characters, Themes, Problems. The idea of what a literary character is, both from a reader's point of view and from the point of view of the writer who creates them, obviously has a lot to do with the ability to simulate a human being. We respond to characters almost instinctively as if they were people, and to the degree that a writer makes them multidimensional or complex, the more lifelike they may seem. Of course, there are degrees of complexity and simplicity, from one character exhibiting many dimensions to others having only one. Some characters evolve or change over the course of a novel, and some remain the same. Those characters who are capable of surprising the reader by seeming to grow in plausible ways are sometimes called round characters, as opposed to those who are limited to one consistent set of behaviors or ways of speaking and thinking. These are called flat characters, and they often play a minor role in a novel. When they appear, the reader more or less knows what to expect from them. The terms round and flat were coined by novelist E.M. Forster, whose 1927 book, Aspects of the Novel, established some of the basic vocabulary of literary analysis, including story, plot, fantasy, prophecy, and rhythm. Forster wrote a number of highly accomplished novels, including Howard's End, A Passage to India, A Room with a View, and Morris. Sometimes we can distinguish major from minor characters simply by noticing how many pages their names or presences occupy, how much space they take in the text. Doing this calls attention to what characters are really made of, which is to say, words on a page, which I think is instructive in helping readers move a little beyond their humanistic or emotional attachments to them. Transitioning from amateur to more skilled or analytical reader of fiction means understanding that the characters are linguistic or textual elements of the narrative. That may mean any number of equally important things to consider. For example, names are important. One of the most delightful elements of the novel form from its earliest beginnings to our own day is how a character's name can sound like a common one at the same time it may carry a number of other associations. This has the effect of making them both real and textually meaningful, a combination of human traits and semantic meanings. There are degrees of what we call individuation across the spectrum of literary characters, which has much to do with how the writer is using those characters for different literary effects. So, for instance, Tom Sawyer sounds exactly right to our ears as a typical American boy's name. It's a name that could plausibly be given to any number of males, and it contains both his Christian first name and his surname or last name. What then do we do with a literary character whose name is just Christian, like the hero of John Bunyan's book Pilgrim's Progress? In that case, the name signifies a concept, or in this case, a moral ideal or religious sensibility, more than it does an individual. We read this character allegorically because all the other characters in that work of fiction are similarly named for ideas. Their interactions with each other throughout the text are likewise clashes of ideas personified. This kind of character may seem, as a result, very far from the ones we meet in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a novel in which the interactions between them seem human and realistic more than they do a clash of ideas. The relationships established between Twain's characters strike us as fairly typical: a father and son, a pair of friends, con men and their victims, etc. And while these are important to the story, they also retain something of the symbolic weight we see more explicitly in the allegorical fiction of writers like John Bunyan and even Nathaniel Hawthorne. In addition, the textual elements of these characters work together to weave other aspects of the literary work like themes, ideas, satire, and symbolism. Even beginning with Tom Sawyer's name, we can train our reading habits and attention to language in the fact that the word sawyer recalling a kind of work people do to process trees into wood or lumber for building things, and given the additional association of the word saw as a song or a story, especially an old and fanciful one, we suddenly realize that the boy who has this name is always telling fantastic stories. He is also someone who comes under the spell of the romantic adventure stories he has read. So while the characters in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn are clearly not out and out allegorical, there are ways in which each of them embodies traits and ideas that generate levels of meaning that go beyond their individuality. Of course, not all of these meanings will be explicit, and to detect them, the reader has to train his or her attention on words, textuality, and plausible associations attached to these character names. And once you do that, a number of deeper readings becomes available, demonstrating the inextricable relationships between a novel's characters and its themes. And with this in mind, let's take a look at how Mark Twain builds his most famous character, Huck Finn. First, consider Huck from the point of view of his social position and how that placement prepares us to accept his close developing friendship with the fugitive slave Jim, who is, of course, bereft both of any social position at all as well as from any standard of full personhood. The larger orchestration of this relationship would go something like this. First, with regard to the society Huck belongs to in the novel, we have to remember that this hasn't been the case up until fairly recently. While we first meet him in the home of Miss Watson and the widow Douglas, he's only there because Tom Sawyer has hunted Huck up to start a band of robbers. We're told this early in the book, that before Tom hunts him up, Huck has been living alone quite contentedly and was free and satisfied. It is the more civilized Tom Sawyer who essentially pulls Huck back into society from this freedom. And when you think about who Tom is and becomes in the novel, combined with the complex historical context out of which this book emerged, there is in Tom's action a very faint echo of the legal incentive to capture and return escaping slaves to their owners, which begins to forge a correspondence between black slaves and poor white boys like Huck. In doing so, slavery as a concept, and perhaps as a more multifaceted condition going beyond one racial group, broadens the scope of that theme and redirects our attention to the conditions that make slavery possible in the first place. As we watch Tom Sawyer's antics throughout the novel, they begin to seem more unusual in their apparent obsession with tying Jim to a tree and then late in the book arranging an elaborate escape plan to free Jim from a condition of enslavement on the Phelps farm that had to be reinvented and performed first in order to do so. When Huck is brought back into what he calls civilization, he is made to join the kinds of institutions that constitute its foundations, namely the family, religion, school, and citizenship. But given Huck's response to his own coerced membership in all of these, we can see how his return to society gives Mark Twain the perfect opportunity to satirize and dismantle the aura of smug conventionality and underlying dysfunction embedded in such hallowed institutions. Of the widow Douglas, Huck says, "She cried over me and called me a poor lost lamb, and she called me a lot of other names, too." The most aggressive thing she does, though, is to take him as her son in order to civilize him. She's a surrogate mother and a widow without a husband. In fact, Huck joins a household distinctly void of adult male figures and finds himself living with two unmarried women. And like Tom taking Huck back into the so-called civilized world, so too do these women turn Huck into a dependent child subject to rules. There is nothing natural or loving in this adoption of Huck into a hyper-feminized world of domestic duties and a mechanical rehearsal of religious sentiments and absurd rituals. To call Huck a lost lamb, as well as many other presumably worse things, speaks to the widow's religious hypocrisy, not to mention that she lives with another woman who owns a slave. She can exert control over the boy because his drunkard father is nowhere to be seen when the novel first opens. Her excessive praying over the food on the dinner table goes on so long that it prevents Huck from eating it when he wants to. Living with the widow Douglas and Miss Watson begins to have an effect on the shaping of Huck's individual identity. He's made to say his prayers even though the widow's abstract explanation of what they're for baffles the boy. He goes to school and begins learning to read and write. In effect, these fundamental pillars of civilization, wearing clean clothes, having table manners, becoming literate, are associated in the book with an exclusively feminine sphere of household chores and genteel domesticity. The more inured Huck becomes to this sphere, the less natural it begins to feel to him, the less boyish he actually is. At an age when most children are still forming an identity, Huck is pliable and impressionable, while nevertheless retaining a solid core of skepticism. The women who take him in represent then a sphere of developmental influence that has a broad hold on the greater society, and there are other spheres as well. For all of their realistic particularity and individuation, characters like the widow and Miss Watson, later Pap and Tom Sawyer, embody types and ideas, forces that go beyond the status of character. In doing so, these kinds of characters begin to signify the institutional, disciplinary, and even instinctual power relations that converge on individual freedom and the making of self-identity. These forces include, of course, psychological and sexual elements as well, and their influences range from major to minor characters that surround Huckleberry Finn. Given that, Huck's engagement with all of these individuals comes to represent the experience of all people who have to negotiate the constraints of culture, social pressure, class and race status, sexual desires, and irrational behaviors to become a coherent assemblage of traits. When Huck's father reappears in his life and demands his son get away from the widow and leave school, another hugely influential sphere emerges in direct opposition to the feminine civilized sphere Huck has begun to get used to. Like two powerful magnetic forces, they stand on either side of Huck, who must struggle to free himself from the attractions and repulsions of an adult, differently gendered world of civilization on the one hand and nature on the other. And although Huck will go back and forth between the widow's civilized ways and his acceptance of education, he soon comes under the more masculine, irrational, dirty, and violent control of Pap, who takes him from one kind of prison to lock him up in another. Pap lives like an animal. His constant inebriation makes him a disinhibited brute. He launches into racist, anti-government rants like a dangerous anarchist. Pap is a word for the kind of mashed food fed to babies, but Pap is also referred to as Adam, which gives him an ancient patriarchal aura, like a vengeful, punishing god. The point here is that these formative elements go into shaping Huck Finn. Drawn to both spheres of influence, he adheres to neither one. He occupies an in-between position, one foot in the civilized, literate world and one in nature, never just one or the other. With regard to what these characters and spheres of influence represent, we might even get some purchase on Huck's psychological makeup in a classic Freudian sense. Pap representing what Freud would describe as the unconscious, irrational id composed of powerful, libidinal, and self-destructive impulses, while the widow represents the containment, refinement, and powers of repression that diffuse the chaotic energies of the id. This is analogous to Freud's description of the superego, that element of the psyche responsible for the moral conscience and need for oppressive self-regulation. Neither of these is dominant in the individual personality, of course, but are held in precarious balance by what Freud names the ego, that sense of self-produced identity that comes from the tension and pressure exerted by the opposing halves of our psyche, the I, as it were, that tells its own story. We can conclude another thing from the way Huck's relationships to other characters suggest larger thematic tensions in the novel. Both his exposure to the widow and his exposure to Pap offer Huck alternatives for deciding what's right and wrong. In other words, those two spheres of influence become the basis for his moral consciousness. We see Huck referring back to each one of those, where in scenes such as the one in which he is stealing a pumpkin, he says what Pap would say, that he's borrowing the pumpkin. Would the widow approve of Huck's acts of generosity or condemn them? The problem here is that the usual trusted sources of moral authority are themselves corrupted, leaving a moral vacuum in Huck's development. But if we feel that Huck makes the right decision when he refuses to turn Jim in to the authorities as they are escaping, where did he get that ability? Is it natural, or has it been learned? And remember, too, that when he decides not to turn Jim in, he completely believes that he is violating the law, that he's in fact doing something immoral, while the reader understands that this is the most moral thing that he can do. Twain amplifies this compromised moral foundation by extending the book's examination of dysfunctional families. If, as many believe, the family is both the microcosm and the basic unit of the state, the families we meet in Mark Twain's novel have rather ominous implications for society. In the house that Jim and Huck come across floating in the river is a scene of absolute disorder. The house is empty, but there are signs of family life scattered everywhere. Just the fact that the home has somehow been lifted from its foundations and tossed into the current of the river conveys a shock of disruption. Later, when Huck is taken in by the Grangerfords, he gets a taste of middle-class comfort and family unity that he's always lacked. Instead of restoring the reader's confidence in this idealized version of the stable and loving Southern family, Twain has Huck learn almost immediately about a dead daughter, Emmeline Grangerford, made locally canonized for her poetic and artistic sensibilities, if not for her actual talent. The more Huck learns about her, the more he gets the fantods and is creeped out by her unfinished drawings and morbid epitaphs. Twain gives some of them whole in the text, and while this produces the desired comic effect, they are also a devastating attack on a certain kind of sentimental poetry that Twain despised. Despised because, as he brilliantly demonstrates in these scenes, Emmeline's death-obsessed sadness and constant mourning is the expression, the symptom, and the cover for generations of murderous feuding between the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons, a kind of war of attrition that echoes the American Civil War. You might wonder at a certain point what this persistent dismantling of the institution of the family is all about. Is it satire meant to bolster the ideals of family life by way of such merciless send-ups of what families should not be? Is there something fundamentally flawed about the biological nuclear family? Another way to account for this aspect of Mark Twain's novel is to see it less as a series of pointless opportunities for humor and satire, and as having a lot to do with positioning the developing character of Huckleberry Finn. By this I mean his unanchored relationship to conventional family bonds, as well as his emotional and moral makeup. By escaping from the surrogate mother figures of the widow and Miss Watson, as well as his well planned escape from his abusive biological father, Huck essentially orphans himself. His status as an orphan may at first generate pity over his lack of adult protection and love, but it also opens the opportunity to replace those more traditional, almost universal kinship relations and socially acceptable norms with more improvised emotional, social, and familial relations. The novel's continual disruption of conventional and approved relationships necessarily liberates and justifies Huck's own choice of affiliation, so that the farther away he gets from adoption into the family, the closer and more intimate he can get to Jim as family. The movement of the plot towards this conversion is itself a kind of argument or moral theme, having to do both with Huck's longing for family and Jim's reintegration into something like the human family. That is to say, Jim's transformation from a thing of property to a man of equal status to all free men. Although the influence on Huck of Tom Sawyer, the widow, and Pap persist in his mind like a residue, those influences, which in most cases contradict each other, come to the surface when Huck needs to decide what's right and wrong, or in moments when he must come to a judgment about people's intentions or character. What you begin to notice in scenes like that is the way Huck presents his wavering thoughts to Jim, and how Jim reveals to Huck the absurdity of ways of thinking derived from other people. While Huck and Jim's exchanges and arguments are comically absurd in and of themselves, what's essentially being shown in them is that Jim, of all unlikely adult figures, takes on an air of genuine authority and moral soundness as he proceeds to re educate Huck Finn. For instance, Jim explicitly disagrees with the widow's interpretation of the so called wisdom of King Solomon, offering his own take on the biblical story of Solomon's verdict to split a child of disputed parents in half to satisfy both parties. Jim sees through the absurdity of such a decision and offers instead a humane plea for the overriding valuation of children's lives. With his patience, gentleness, superstitions, and deep affection for the boy who accompanies him down the river, Jim's character is both open to criticism as a derogatory stereotype and a redeeming representation of a fully human man. It may seem like a minor observation, but Jim has a family of his own in the novel. Moreover, he cares deeply about them, even relaying a story to Huck about learning his daughter is deaf. These feelings militate against the idea, widespread at the time, that slaves did not have the same kinds of attachment to their family members as white people did because they were considered property to be bought and sold without regard to kinship relations. Twain would have known how black slaves were portrayed in print as well. As we've seen, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin would have provided him with a good example of humane representation. But there were other examples, too, that included publications in which slaves or former slaves themselves presented their own experiences in books like The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, in 1845. Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861, 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup in 1853, and John Andrew Jackson's The Experience of a Slave in South Carolina in 1862. In fact, hundreds of slave narratives were produced and disseminated throughout the 19th century. There were among them tales of redemption, tales meant to inspire and abet the abolitionist movement, and deeply human stories of intellectual and spiritual growth. And yet, the figure of Jim remains controversial. It might be useful then to look at some of Mark Twain's comments about slavery made outside the actual novel, and to remember once again the delicate balancing act this author was trying to maintain between the expectations of his readers throughout a divided country and those with more progressive views about the peculiar institution of American slavery. What one gleans from these statements is Twain's own evolving, complicated relationship to the question of race and slavery. From a notebook he kept during the period he wrote Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain wrote, "In those old slaveholding days, the whole community was agreed as to one thing, the awful sacredness of slave property. To help steal a horse or a cow was a low crime. But to help a hunted slave, or feed him, or shelter him, or hide him, or comfort him in his troubles, his terrors, his despair, or hesitate to promptly betray him to the slave catcher when opportunity offered, was a much baser crime, and carried with it a stain, a moral smirch which nothing could wipe away. That this sentiment should exist among slave owners is comprehensible. There were good commercial reasons for it. But that it should exist and did exist among the paupers, the loafers, the tag rag and bobtail of the community, and in a passionate and uncompromising form, is not in our remote day realizable. It seemed natural enough to me then, natural enough that Huck and his father, the worthless loafer, should feel it and approve it, though it seems now absurd. It shows that that strange thing, the conscience, the unerring monitor, can be trained to approve any wild thing you want it to approve if you begin its education early and stick to it. In his later novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Twain wrote, "The poor whites of our South, who were always despised and frequently insulted by the slave lords around them, and who owed their base condition simply to the presence of slavery in their midst, were yet pusillanimously ready to side with the slave lords in all political moves for the upholding and perpetuating of slavery, and did also finally shoulder their muskets and pour out their lives in an effort to prevent the destruction of that very institution which degraded them. And there was only one redeeming feature connected with that pitiful piece of history, and that was that secretly the poor white did detest the slave lord and did feel his own shame. That feeling was not brought to the surface, but the fact that it was there and could have been brought out under favoring circumstances was something. In fact, it was enough, for it showed that a man is at bottom a man after all, even if it doesn't show on the outside. In 1904, Twain jotted down in his notebook, "The skin of every human being contains a slave," and later, "Man is the only slave, and he is the only animal who enslaves. He has always been a slave in one form or another, and has always held other slaves in bondage under him in one way or another. In our day, he is always some man's slave for wages, and does that man's work. And this slave has other slaves under him for minor wages, and they do his work. The higher animals are the only ones who exclusively do their own work and provide their own living." Perhaps the most famous scene in the novel is that in which Huck condemns himself to hell for deciding not to turn in Jim to his owner, Miss Watson. An early review of the book from the Hartford Courant in February 1885 put it this way: "Mr. Clemens strikes in a very amusing way certain psychological problems. What, for instance, in the case of Huck, the son of the town drunkard, perverted from the time of his birth, is conscience, and how does it work? Most amusing is the struggle Huck has with his conscience in regard to slavery. The review continues: "The whole study of Huck's moral nature is as serious as it is amusing. His confusion of wrong as right and his abnormal mendacity, traceable to his training from infancy, is a singular contribution to the investigation of human nature." The scene this reviewer is referring to goes this way. Conscience says to me, "What had poor Miss Watson done to you that you could see her nigger go off right under your eyes and never say one single word? What did that poor old woman do to you that you could treat her so mean? Why, she tried to learn you your book, she tried to learn you your manners, she tried to be good to you every way she knowed how. That's what she done. I got to feeling so mean and miserable I most wished I was dead. I fidgeted up and down the raft, abusing myself to myself, and Jim was fidgeting up and down past me. We neither of us could keep still." At this point, the raft encounters some men looking for runaway slaves, and despite Huck's misgivings, he tells a lie about his father having the highly contagious smallpox, which repulses the men and sends them on their way, leaving Jim safe for the time being. Huck says, "They went off, and I got aboard the raft, feeling bad and low, because I knowed very well I had done wrong, and I see it warn't no use for me to try to learn to do right. A body that don't get started right when he's little ain't got no show. When the pinch comes, there ain't nothing to back him up and keep him to his work, and so he gets beat. Then I thought a minute and says to myself, 'Hold on, s'pose you'd 'a' done right and give Jim up. Would you felt better than what you do now?' 'No,' says I, 'I'd feel bad. I'd feel just the same way I do now.' 'Well then,' says I, 'what's the use you learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and ain't no trouble to do wrong, and the wages is just the same?' I was stuck. I couldn't answer that, so I reckoned I wouldn't bother no more about it, but after this always do whichever come handiest at the time." The passage concludes with Huck deciding his best course of action is to do what comes handiest at the time, which might be seen as pragmatic. In other words, whatever moral quality we see here is clearly a situational morality guided by Huck's betting on an advantageous outcome. Exposing himself as the companion of a runaway slave would get him in trouble. Having Jim taken away by these men will leave Huck alone navigating the raft. Being caught might even mean having to go back to Pap, whom he believes is still living. In fact, none of these reasons has to do with protecting Jim's freedom. Or do they? To conclude that Huck is just being opportunistic and practical is to miss Mark Twain's deeper irony and target of satire here. We have to go back to Huck's guilty conscience about Miss Watson, who has, after all, tried to educate and civilize Huck, making him a more respectable member of polite society. The problem, of course, is that most of the so-called respectable members of society are religious hypocrites or slave owners or murderers like Colonel Sherburne, who shoots a man dead in the street for insulting his honor. On some level, Huck seems to understand this disparity when he questions the purpose of book learning. He says, "What's the use you learning to do right when it's troublesome to do right and ain't no trouble to do wrong, and the wages is the same?" At this point, yet another possibility opens up about the source of Huck's moral conscience, based on feeling, either bad or good, about one's actions. This might lead us to believe that Mark Twain has created a character who is good by nature, or who can instinctively tell by his own feeling what counts as morally correct behavior and what doesn't. There are numerous instances when this seems true in the novel, but often when Huck thinks of the right thing to do, the humane thing, that is, he consults his mind to see if it would please the widow, or pass muster with Tom Sawyer, or even whether Pap would respond one way or the other. The vast middle section of the novel is episodic, fast-moving, and features a number of encounters on land that disrupt any sustained feeling of idyllic drifting on the river that we may have been lured into wanting for Jim and Huck. As they begin to encounter new people, both on the river and especially on the shore, the novel's scope begins to expand. It's not just a matter of throwing in new characters and different settings to extend what you might call the comic elements of this picaresque tale, which is a perfectly legitimate way to enjoy the book. In fact, the first advertisements for Huckleberry Finn stressed the larger numbers of chapters it had compared to Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Readers of the newer book would get more bang for their buck, in other words. What I think we can safely say is what astute readers and critics have often pointed out about the real literary achievement of these multiple episodes that move beyond simply repeating the comic encounters. One is that you begin to appreciate Mark Twain's grasp of multiple forms of American popular culture. The American response to performing the works of Shakespeare, for instance, reveals that the plays were not revered as sacred texts. They were wildly popular for their mad characters, their sword fights, their romantic lovers, etc., etc. We not only get glimpses of simple country folk, but a variety of social classes, from the strange mix of middle class and aristocratic shepherdsons to town drunks, con men, and so on. It's not just a panorama of vernacular culture, but an opportunity to satirize some of the more nefarious hypocrisies, cruelties, and motivations behind the official set of values operating throughout the culture. The river presents its own natural dangers, like the treacherous fog, like powerful steamers that threaten to mow down the little raft. The river is a kind of dumping ground for dead bodies, abandoned houses, people who have committed crimes. The raft itself gets taken over by the king and the duke, whose fake aristocratic lineage and phony titles license them to make subjects of Huck and Jim. You might even see the river as beginning to get contaminated or exploited by the encroachment of civilization. This would make the novel part of a wider literary response and representation of the environmental impact of American expansion. And while it is true that the panorama of scenes and multiple characters suggests the messiness of American democracy at mid century, it also is a picture that dwells upon the potential for tyranny that comes when there are no social or legal prohibitions in place to protect the exploitation of weaker, more innocent minorities. Increasingly, in this sequence of episodes, various crowds are featured. I think this is significant for several reasons, beginning with the most general one. This is society, clearly, but a very particular kind of society. It's one that constitutes an American democratic society. As such, there is an unpredictability to it. It's also not purely democratic in that many kinds of people are not part of its collective voice. There's a volatility or mob quality to the crowd, one that can turn mean and violent at any moment. But depending upon whoever is skillful enough or charismatic enough or rich enough to gain the crowd's attention and perhaps bend its will, the crowd can also seem passive, docile, gullible. On the other hand, crowds act as audiences or witnesses to public events or social interactions. Every time they appear, whether gathered in the town square or buying tickets to the circus, they lend a public aura to the actions of individual characters. The inherent danger of any democratic society has always been the tyranny of the majority, or the susceptibility to tyrannical control. Having said that, Twain's mobs or crowds are, in addition to serving as objects of democratic scrutiny, a kind of chorus. Not in the sense of Greek drama exactly, where the chorus comments or reflects on the actions of individuals, but in the sense that their reactions to these things becomes a barometer for the reader's understanding, helping us interpret the overall meaning. And finally, the crowds who watch the dramas unfold, who laugh at the drunken Boggs until Colonel Sherburne comes out and threatens him, are a version of Twain's readers, a version of us. We can laugh at many things in the novel until the rug is pulled out from under us and we begin to wonder why we thought something was funny. To get a clearer sense of what Mark Twain is getting at here, consider what happens after Huck Finn witnesses the cold-blooded killing of Boggs by Colonel Sherburne. We haven't really seen Huck's emotional response to that event while it's happening, but in the chapter which follows that one, he decides to get away from the chaos and fear of the explosive street crowd, to retreat into a circus tent for some amusing entertainment. But in fleeing from the real world into the make-believe one of the circus, something happens to Huck Finn. Something, it would seem, that could only have happened in such a place. Here's the passage in question. Well, all through the circus they'd done the most astonishing things, and all the time that clown carried on so it most killed the people. The ringmaster couldn't ever say a word to him, but he was back at him, quick as a wink, with the funniest things a body ever said. And how he ever could think of so many of them, and so sudden and so pat, was what I couldn't no way understand. Why, I couldn't have thought of them in a year. And by, a drunk man tried to get into the ring, said he wanted to ride, said he could ride as well as anybody that ever was. They argued and tried to keep him out, but he wouldn't listen, and the whole show come to a standstill. Then the people begun to holler at him and make fun of him, and that made him mad, and he began to rip and tear, so that stirred up the people, and a lot of men begun to pile down off of the benches and swarm towards the ring, saying, "Knock him down, throw him out," and one or two women begun to scream. So then the ringmaster, he made a little speech. He said he hoped there wouldn't be no disturbance, and if the man would promise he wouldn't make no more trouble, he would let him ride, if he thought he could stay on the horse. So everybody laughed and said, "All right," and the man got on. The minute he was on, the horse begun to rip and tear and jump and cavort around, with two circus men hanging on to his bridle, trying to hold him, and the drunk man hanging on to his neck, and his heels flying in the air every jump, and the whole crowd of people standing up shouting and laughing till tears rolled down. And at last, sure enough, all the circus men could do, the horse broke loose, and away he went, like the very nation, round and round the ring, with that sot laying down on him and hanging on to his neck, with first one leg hanging most to the ground on one side, and then t'other one on t'other side, and the people just crazy. It weren't funny to me, though. I was all of a tremble to see his danger. What is Huck thinking here? Three images of drunken men form a strange composite in his mind, and the premonition that they will die, or be killed, or will fall from a horse, or be driven out, gives us sudden insight into Huck's most inarticulate feelings, his most childlike fears, and his very adult disgust with the worst instincts of human nature. It's a circus that makes such depths of insight possible, a simple form of popular entertainment, like a children's book, a funny satire, an American classic.